I think one of the trickiest parts of the modern state of React is understanding the distinction between server and client components and the nuances between when a component is rendered on the server or when it's rendered in the browser. And reading through the docs here of some of the latest features that are going to be released here in React 19, it kind of goes over a deep dive into how a component can be both a server and a client component. And this is going to get a little bit tricky, but hopefully this becomes clear as I explain it. So what it kind of goes over here is that in this example component hierarchy here, you have your root component, your app component, and then you have this fancy text component. And you can see in this case, this inspiration generator here, this is a client component. So this like brown color represents a client component. So inspiration generator and fancy text, both of these are client components. But app here is a server component. Fancy text over here is a server component, and copyright is a server component. So in this hierarchy or this component tree, how is fancy text here both a client component as well as a server component? And I think this is partially where this distinction between client and server components gets a little bit tricky in modern day React. And we're not even talking Next.js here. In React 19, they're going to be kind of coming out with these different use server and use client directives that are going to make server components and stuff like this by default something that you need to understand when using React, regardless of whether you're using Next.js or not. So as they mention here, by the above definitions, the component fancy text is both a server and client component. And here they clarify that when they say component, there's kind of two ways of defining this. You can define it as the component definition when you just create your like component file and your function within that file, but you also have the usage of your component. So here they mention that this is where the component is defined and this is where the component is used. And then down here, they say when thinking about client and server components, they're referring to component usages. And I would probably amend this a little bit after reading this and understanding this better, in which I think they're referring to the component usages as well as the component definition. So here, if a component is defined in a module with a use client directive, it is considered a client component. So there they're referring to the component definition. If you define a component within a file that uses the use client directive at the top of the file, then that is going to indeed make it a client component. However, if a component, even if it doesn't have the use client directive at the top of the file, if that component is imported and called in a client component, then it is also a client component. Otherwise, it is a server component. So your component is going to become a client component, meaning your function is going to be rendered in the browser and it's going to have access to all the different browser APIs. That is going to occur if you use the use client directive, the string at the very top of the file like you might in Next.js, or if you have a server component that you import and use in a client component, that is going to also make it render in the browser. Otherwise, it is going to be a server component. So here in this render tree, you have fancy text here, which it doesn't have the use client directive. So when it's imported and used within this app component, it remains a server component. But inspiration generator here, this is a client component. It has the use client directive. So when you take fancy text here and you import it into inspiration generator and use it there, it's going to become a client component and be rendered on the client as well. Now, you might be wondering, for this copyright component in this component tree, why is it still a server component if it is used in this inspiration generator? Well, they kind of talk about this down here. Why is copyright a server component? Well, they mention that recall that use client defines the boundary between server and client code on the module dependency tree, not the render tree. So the module dependency tree, meaning where files are imported and exported into each other, not necessarily the render tree of how components are rendered as children of one another. So if we look at the module dependency tree here, we'll see that the copyright component, it's not actually imported into this inspiration generator component. They actually just import copyright into app.js, and they also import this inspiration generator into app.js, but then copyright is rendered as a child of inspiration generator. So they're both imported into app.js, but copyright is just rendered as a child of inspiration generator, meaning that since copyright is still imported into a server component, it is still treated as a server component. So here they kind of explain this further to where in the module dependency tree, we see that app.js imports and calls copyright from the copyright.js module. As copyright does not contain a use client directive, then component is still rendered on the server. App is rendered on the server as it is the root component. Client components can render server components because you can pass JSX as props. In this case, inspiration generator, this client component here, receives copyright as children. However, the inspiration generator module never directly imports copyright, nor calls the component. It just renders it as a child. All of that is done by the app component. In fact, copyright component is fully executed before inspiration generator starts rendering. The takeaway is that parent-child render relationship between components does not guarantee the same render environment. All right, so just to recap here, I know that this is a little bit tricky. I still find this a little bit tricky to get used to with thinking about React in terms of client and server these days. But to just kind of reiterate here, the way that you have a client component is if you use the use client directive at the top of the file. So if this file had use client here at the very top above the component definition, that would make that a client component, meaning it is rendered in the browser. However, it also becomes a client component even if it doesn't have that use client directive, if it is imported and called within a client component. Else, everything else is going to be a server component. So if you have a server component, you can still render that as a child of a client component, and it will remain a server component as long as that server component is not imported and called within that client component. So in this case of copyright, if it's imported and called with an app, and it's just rendered as a child of this inspiration generator client component, it will still remain a server component. So I know this is tricky. I would definitely recommend going to this section of the docs and reading more about this. And of course, as React 19 gets released and you start working with it and stuff, I'm sure you'll get used to it more. But I think that this distinction is important to understand it, and is now becoming a core fundamental of React that I think is important to understand. So hopefully this helps clear some of that up. I know it helped clear some stuff up for me, so hopefully it did the same for you. So thanks for tuning into this, and I'll see you in that next one.